So can you please put your hands together for Hanna Naima McCloskey, founder and CEO of Fearless Futures, Josie Young, feminist AI researcher, transformation manager at Methods and co-chair of the YWCA, Sofia Olhede, professor of statistics at UCL, and Carol Reiley, board member of Drive.ai. Can we give them a round of applause and will you all join me, please? Hello. Are we all good? Fantastic. So I suppose let's start with you first, Josie. Do you want to tell us a bit about what you do and your views on all that we're discussing today?
Sure. Hi everybody. I hope you can hear me okay. I hope I don't whack my earrings into my mic too often. So I've got a couple of hats. I'm co-chair of the YWCA, which is a charity that is obsessed with young women's leadership and amplifying young women's voices. I'm also a transformation manager at a company called Methods, and we lead a lot of digital transformation work with public sector clients. And at the moment, we're looking a lot at how do you build ethical AI for the public sector, taking into account the responsibilities and the different kind of groups of people that are going to end up using those services that have AI baked into them. And thirdly, and probably more relevant for the panel, is I'm a feminist AI researcher. So I'm basically obsessed with how do you look at bias in AI, how do you address it, how do you decide what you want to do with it when you found it. And through that, I've been involved in a couple of different research pieces. The first one is I developed a feminist chatbot building process. Yes, which is very exciting. And it's all about how do you understand the values that you're baking into your conceptual design of your chatbot. And lastly, I've been involved in a piece of research called It Speaks. It's actually being launched tomorrow at CogX at the research stage at 11 a.m. Please, everybody be there. And that's been looking at how do you identify bias within the big data sets that we use to train machine learning. And once you've found it, what do you do with it? What's a good framework for kind of taking steps to address that bias? And my colleague Lisa Talia-Moretti will be presenting that tomorrow. So that's me.
Thank you. Thanks, Josie. Carol?
Great. My name is Carol Reiley. I am a recovering academic. I've spent the last 20 years in robotics and AI. I did my graduate work at Johns Hopkins, spent a year out at Stanford, and most recently started a self-driving car company. So I'm from Silicon Valley. It's a company called Drive.ai, and it does self-driving cars. I think a lot about also bias and ethics, specifically about life and death and how that affects product design. So I'll be giving a talk tomorrow at around 2 o'clock, I think. On the side, I also have written a children's book on growth mindset, which I do think heavily ties into failure and entrepreneurship, and do a lot of other work. So my previous background has been in space robotics, underwater robotics, surgical robotics, and I most recently started a healthcare startup.
Brilliant. Oh, so just a few things.
Yeah.
Just a few things, Carol. Sophia, what about you?
So, I'm a professor of statistics, an honorary professor of computer science, and an honorary research associate in the Department of Mathematics at University College London. I'm originally a mathematician, not an area that has a lot of women. I'm therefore used to being the only woman in the room and the only woman speaker. So much I don't even notice it most of the time anymore. I helped to set up the Alan Turing Institute when I was also most of the time the only woman in the room at the start. And I take a lot of interest in trying to figure out what should we do to develop the ethics and the regulations that we need, which for someone coming from a very technical background the way I am is a little bit of a leap. But I decided that if us techie people who understand the repercussions of setting standards and figuring out the meaning of things don't get involved, how can we end up with the right outcomes?
Yeah, fantastic. Hanna?
Great. Hi everyone, my name is Hanna Naima McCloskey. I'm the founder and CEO of an education organisation called Fearless Futures. We work with adults across sectors, but specifically in this context within the tech industry, supporting their design teams and others to really have robust understandings of the root causes of inequities. We use a participative and experiential learning method in order to have sustainable and transformative learning. And in particular, a program that we've developed, a program of education and method called Design for Inclusion, which is specifically about how we can unite design thinking with methods to challenge oppression that are anti-inequity, with a clear focus on understanding overlapping oppressions, so not just looking at inequities in silos, but really acknowledging that we all live complex existences, and therefore for our artificial intelligence to be building a future that is just and equitable, we need to be able to look at competing ideas and hold them in our heads at once, and also look at how they overlap.
Brilliant. So I'll start with you, Hanna, as you just finished. As you work with organizations and you advise them on why it's important to have inclusive environments, can you tell me why you think it's dangerous not to, particularly in relation to AI and some of the data that we're talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's often a kind of unwritten assumption that science is somehow neutral and value-free and objective. But we know that that isn't the case. I mean, the eugenics movement was seen as a very legitimate, heavily invested scientific industry when in its heyday, and it was a tool of oppression. It was an arm of a racist state, you could argue. So I think what's really important is that what we are inscribing and encoding into our technology has real life impacts on people in different ways. The benefits and the harms are not distributed in the same way, and some people are explicitly advantaged at the expense of others. And so we really need to be able to interrogate science in an interdisciplinary way, actually, and I would say that we really need to draw on what we know from social sciences about how inequities play out in order to infuse and inform our artificial intelligence.
Sophia, would you like to add to that?
Well, I think there's a sort of assumption that if we just wait long enough, then all inequalities will sort themselves out, because surely it can't be optimal not to take advantage of the entire population. And it was something I felt very strongly when I finished my PhD. And looking now, 16 years down the line, magically the situation has not sorted itself out. In fact, it has barely improved.
Yeah.
So I think as we start to build the infrastructure and the algorithms we're going to be using to sort a lot of problems in the future, if we entrench these things right from the start, we're not going to be in a good place.
No, completely. So can you tell me, what do you think, Carol, what is the actual process of actually designing AI that is inclusive?
Yeah, it's a really nuanced question. I think everyone knows there's no silver bullet. There's not going to be one easy answer. And I feel a lot like Alice in Wonderland, that when you start digging in this problem, the more issues you find, because I think the problem is that humans are so inherently biased and
complex.
And complex, yes. Yeah. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, because bias can be good, because if we lose our biases, you're going to lose so much of what it means to be human. And you know, if you make an AI system unbiased, it's going to have no preference, no anything, and it's going to be very bland. So that's like the opposite of what AI is supposed to do. So it really tugs at me when we're trying to figure out what is good bias and what is bad bias, and how do you teach a child.
And how do you determine that?
Yes, and how do you give it all that input? So I think the process is challenging because it starts from the data you gather to the annotators who get bored, and we see them make very common mistakes as time goes on. It's the engineers that are designing the algorithms, it's the testers, it's the product team, it's the end users that are biased when they interact with the system. I'll give you one example. Back in the 1990s, the navigation systems in cars in Germany had a voice of a female, and the consumers in Germany complained that this navigation system sucked, it didn't work, and they did a recall at BMW for these navigation systems. The engineers did not change the algorithms, they changed the voice to a male voice, and all of a sudden it worked well. And so that's something very inherently about a culture, which is interesting to crack. So I think what AI will do is expose our own biases back to us, and we have to determine what we want to do with that. It's not going to solve everything.
So do you think it only changes when we change, basically?
Yeah, and that's a major problem, because that we across different parts of the world don't even agree on. So it's going to be an interesting decade and century moving forward here.
Wow, so what you're saying, this is a minefield.
I think it's going to be really exciting, and there's going to be lots of opportunities that will expose us.
Brilliant. So Josie, tell me, how does your feminist chatbot actually lead the way on this?
That's a great question. So I was thinking just then about, Carol, what you were just saying, and it's really, so the research that I did set out to understand how do you build feminist chatbots, and is that about the product itself being, hard-coded feminist, or is it about the way that the product is built?
Okay.
And sort of coming back to what we've just been talking about, with humans being biased, we need to sort of start there. And so the process that I developed, it looks at the role of a team in building a product. It looks at the conceptual design phase, and it says, you know what, at this point, we need to start being explicit about our values and our bias. And as a team, talk about what they are.
Those difficult conversations.
Exactly, and it's almost like give permission to have that conversation and do it in a way that doesn't require people to have a PhD in ethics or a feminist degree of some kind. So I built this process hoping to kind of provide an intervention for people to think critically about this stuff, and I tested it at a hackathon. And what was interesting was the group that didn't have the process found it very difficult to talk about bias and values, and when their values or biases as a team would come up against the biases and values of the user for their intended chatbot. Versus the team that had the process, they had given themselves permission to have these very difficult conversations. And in their notes on their papers that I, as a good researcher, took away with me, they had questions like, how is my bias going to be influencing this design? Which is amazing and exactly what I wanted to happen. So I think there's giving that space, that permission to say, you know what, we need to think critically about these things, we need to be explicit about them, and you don't have to have anything other than a safe space for a conversation in order to do that.
Picking up on what Carol said, so how are you determining what makes feminism for that chatbot? What criteria are you using?
So,
because as you said, that in itself is such a broad view, isn't it?
Yeah, and I tried to make the framework as, I guess, not overtly feminist as possible. So there's really only one section that talks about gender, and that is the design of the chatbot, the persona. So, why are all the chatbots women? Question. And what harmful stereotypes are we baking into our AI to have thousands of conversations around the world at any one time with? So I think it's more the feminist principle of transformation, of allowing people to recognise where they're socially situated in the world. So feminist standpoint theory says you're always a product of your environment, and those things you carry with you everywhere you go. And so we need to think about how that then interacts with other things in the world. So it's more about, I guess, that transformative space, that transformative mindset. And then the idea is that if you have transformed people, in a ideally feminist way, or intersectional feminist way, I should say.
Yes.
Then exactly, and then hopefully they will go on to build transformed technology. So you kind of start upstream as much as possible.
So it's back to having everyone in the room,
Exactly.
basically. So Sofia, one of the criticisms or one of the concerns that is often brought up when we talk about getting more women into STEM jobs is that there aren't enough women in STEM in the first place. And when you look at the data around it, I mean, in terms of the number of young girls taking STEM subjects, it is quite shocking and it is worrying and concerning. So how do we address it from that end of the issue in order to actually have more women in the marketplace?
Well, the first is actually to be mindful as we recruit. So as part of helping to set up the Turing Institute, I led the first recruitment of research fellows. And when we got to the stage when we were going to shortlist, we took a look at the people we had originally intended to shortlist, and we calculated the percentage that were women, and it was absolutely very, very low. So we went back and we said, we can't have it, this. We're just not going to go forward unless we can remedy it. And we went back and we checked all the women applicants who had been very near the cutoff, and we put them back on the table. And we said, we're just going to give them the opportunity to be interviewed, and then we'll take it from there. And that brought us up from having 1 or 2 women shortlisted to having a 4th being women when we actually hired. So I think you can't just wait and expect things to get sorted on their own merit. You actually have to take the steps so that things happen. And I think that's tremendously important.
And so do you think the fact that you were part of the process is why those decisions were made? Because had you not been in the room, probably they wouldn't have gone back to say, actually, what can we do to make sure there are more women?
Well, that's impossible to say. I mean, once I brought the issue up, there was definitely support. But as always in academia, there were also the comments that we can only go on pure quality, and the chips fell this way, and that's the way the chips fell.
Yeah.
And I think that just didn't have enough merit, because interviewing a few more people, it's not taking away opportunities for others, it's just remedying something that clearly had gone wrong.
Totally. So Carol, do you think that gender influences the work that you do in any way, shape or form?
Yeah, I think being in Silicon Valley and the whole startup scene, there's definitely, this year especially, has had a lot of attention on kind of turning around Silicon Valley. The number is 7% of VCs are female, so those are the ones funding companies, and when they can't relate to a certain problem or product, then they
or even founder.
Exactly, yeah. So it was actually really shocking for me when I went, because I was the one leading fundraising, and so for my Series B, we raised, I think we've raised a total of 77 million, and NEA led our Series B round, and they're the largest VC in Silicon Valley. It was interesting because a lot of my VCs came up to me afterwards and was like, Carol, you did not get harassed as you met with all the VCs this year, did you? And I said, no, nothing happened to me. But it was weird because I felt like I was a more unusual case than I felt like every female founder I met had a specific story. Right. That doesn't mean that I haven't encountered like harassment or things, but it was not during my fundraising round. What was a positive outcome from fundraising, though, is that I think we probably have one of the highest number of board members that are female, because I think because I was fundraising, our lead VC is female, and another board observer who joined was also female, so we've got 3 out of 7, which is surprisingly high in Silicon Valley. So that was great. But it does trickle down from fundraising to how we build teams, and there is so much groupthink, because our lab came out of the Stanford AI lab, so everyone is trained a certain way, everyone worked at Google or Facebook, and those were just the boxes you check in that pipeline with that same path. They were looking at people who were like them and came from a similar training, did run into issues in terms of hiring, because there just aren't that many females that go along that same path.
That trajectory,
So we've been trying to figure out different ways to build diverse teams, female being one, so I do have us track the numbers every quarter, but it becomes challenging because sometimes you try to meet that quarter's goals. So if you just have a women number, I saw people trying to game it by hiring like admins or like labelers, and so we reached that number, but we had to really break it down in terms of execs, engineers, people with a voice. So it requires a lot of thought, and it requires extra time from like an engineering team, which is already recruiting and hiring like 70% of their time. It's very hard.
Yeah, but I think that honest mirror is actually so important, and understanding where we are in the industry to be able to address it. So what you're doing is absolutely brilliant in that regard.
And I think one thing is, this panel is about women, but I think as a woman of color, it's also a really interesting paradox, because Asians are actually overrepresented in tech.
Actually, yes.
So for me, I'm also trying to think who else isn't in that room. Other people of color so if I was a white male, I can't help my DNA, but how do I, as an Asian female, which is a represented group, think about the other people? So I try to also help others that are a smaller minority than I am.
Yeah, fantastic. It's that intersectional approach. So that leads perfectly to you, Hanna. So what advice have you got? We have a lot of founders in the room. What advice have you got for people who are building teams to actually look at this stuff from the outset of creating a company and creating a team?
I think the question is, what are you optimizing your teams for? Just going back to the VC point, there's the kind of head VC of a firm called Backstage Capital. Her name is Arlan, and I've forgotten her surname, but she has just, Abba, you'll know. Arlen Hamilton. Sorry, thanks, Abba. And she has just invested in 100 different founders, the majority of whom are women of colour.
Wow.
And everyone told her it was going to be impossible and it wasn't going to be done. And she was optimising for the fact that she was going to make it possible. She believed they were there because they are.
Them.
Pardon?
And she found
them.
Yeah.
They were hidden figures around America, you know, it's not even that, you know, larger landmass. And so I think there's a question here about if you are what are you setting up your teams to do? What are you setting up your models to do? What's being optimized? Is it just profit and speed? In which case, crack on. You're probably not going to be that interested in this. It will take more time because you're doing something that is out of your path of least resistance. And in order to do that, that takes additional effort. Is it the right thing to do? Of course, I don't believe in this business case piece myself because I've never seen a report on the business case for white people to be in employment. And I've never seen a business case document about men having a right to employment. So until I see those, I'm like, I just don't see why we have to spend lots of energy focusing on some people's right to be represented in the workplace.
See, I don't see it as the right to be. I see it as a missed opportunity.
For
so
sure.
I look at it differently. I think I want to see the business case. Because actually, if you're a founder, this is what you're missing out on when you're excluding such a large chunk of the population.
Completely. And I think that, you know, to the point around intersectionality, what we know from the research is that when people have said women, what's ended up is that white middle class women have disproportionately benefited from just that singular lens. And until we're going to look at our data intersectionally, so when I speak to organizations, I say, I know you're doing all this great gathering of the number of women, yay you, but also are you looking at this with other oppressions that people are experiencing? And until you can tell me what the percentage of women of colour are in your organisation, you're not thinking more broadly, and fundamentally we're going to end up with a skewed understanding of what's actually happening on the ground.
I love that. Thank you. Well, we have time for probably 3 questions. Anybody have a question? Thank you. Yeah.
Is there a limit to how many women can improve the nature of groups? Does it balance out at 50-50, or do we get an added advantage by having a 70-30 break with women to men?
So with Tom Malone's, I mean, I'll let other people answer. With Tom Malone's work, what his work shows is that actually it's the balance. So you want that sort of, the ideal is around that 50-50 number. But actually, the more women you have on a team, getting to that number is better. So you don't want it going the other way. The whole point is about having a balanced workforce, so if you can.
Can I add something? I often, when I think about targets or caps or whatever, I think more about how can we cap an overrepresented group in a particular space so that we can then open up that space for other people. So not just about, okay, we need to get a woman in here. It's like, actually, we need to have way too many men in here. How do we put a line and then leave some space for other people to come along? And it doesn't necessarily need to be a white woman. It can be a woman of colour. It can be a man of colour. It can be someone with a disability. Let's kind of open it up. Yeah. So I think sometimes we talk about why women in AI, and maybe we should be thinking more about why intersectional transformative feminism in AI, because I think that then serves a larger group of people.
Yeah. Anybody else? Good. Hi. And then there's a man down there, or lady down there. Yeah.
I think what you said, Sofia, about like opening the route into STEM is through recruitment. Do you think that's just an important step to do, or do you think we should like lower the gates and like increase the pipeline straight from like a young age and influencing young people to like, oh yeah, this is IT, this is science, we should, you know, what are we goals for maybe like something neutral so they can increase their more likelihood to like go into education and science and maths in the future?
I think it ends up being a lot about role models.
Yeah.
I've heard other people who were in younger years than myself, for instance, that they saw at least one other woman who was pursuing that career. So I think people need to see examples that you can do it, because otherwise they don't think, what if I did that?
Yeah.
Of course, we need people to go through the whole pipeline or they never get to the end. But it needs to be effort at both sides, both encouraging more people to take the first steps in, but also not to have the leaky pipe. So if you look at most professions where women are underrepresented, often at the junior level, there are more women. So most undergraduate math degrees has a 45-55 split. That doesn't seem too bad. Keep on going, and when you're up to the level of professor, there are perhaps 20 women professors of statistics in the whole of the UK, right? Wow. So it becomes individual singular occurrences that you have a woman. And I don't know any other way than trying to push at all ends, right?
Yeah. I heard a great summary of the issue, which was like, only an idiot would try to fix a leaky pipe by putting in more water. So like, obviously you're gonna have to like, the water needs to come, but you also need to like, you know, fix it structurally as well as just shoving more in there and then being like, nothing else has changed, maybe these people will be different.
Why is it still leaking?
Yeah.
I like that.
But it's also a lot about encouragement, because what you find is that with women going through the career stage, they're less likely to put themselves forward for things. So to get to the end of the leaky pipe, whether it's leaky or not, I think we all, men and women alike, need to give more encouragement, both to shy men, shy whatever, and to women.
Yeah, totally. There's a lady there who had a question, yeah? Do you want to stand up so we can hear you? Sorry. Yes. We have a mic coming to you, so let's...
Hi, thank you. Super interesting. I just have a kind of I get asked this a lot, so I thought maybe you could answer it, Sofia. For when you were saying that you were hiring and there were women that maybe didn't quite make it in, and so you kind of opened the catchment so that they could be interviewed. I know a lot of men who are like, that's not fair. And my brother recently wasn't offered a professorial role in Sydney because they wanted to give it to a woman. And he was like, you and your feminism, this is so annoying, it's making it unfair. How do I respond to people like that lay claim that it's not fair?
So all we did was we opened up a few more slots, and then the people who were just in line happened to be women, so we didn't really have to do anything artificial at all. I think the problem is that both women and men, when they assess women, often underestimate their ability. So what we also did was we discussed this at the start of each shortlisting panel. And I think that's necessary for men and women to hear. As for your brother, of course, as an individual, it always feels unfair, because we're now confounding what's fair for a whole group versus what might be fair for that individual. I think in Australia, I believe it is legal to advertise for only women applicants, because I've seen it for other professorial roles there. I don't think that's legal here. So at the end of the day, we'll have to follow the laws of the country. And I mean, life is unfair in general, and why should it be your problem rather than somebody else's that he wasn't shortlisted? I mean, does he know it was only because he was a man, or maybe he just wasn't as good as some of the men who were shortlisted? But maybe don't ask your brother that, because it might make for awkward dinners.
It's such an important point, because at the heart of any of this, if a woman of colour gets a role and I say, I didn't get it because...
Yeah, tell your brother, welcome to my world. Tell him that.
There's such a level of entitlement, right? Because you're like, well, that was for me. But it's for everyone. Why do you think that you had some sort of fast-track route? But it's because historically, there would be no other competition for that role. And so we just need to say, like, up your game. Yeah. Like, just up the game.
Blonde lady, lady in the glasses, yeah.
Just to say that this might have to be the last question.
Yeah,
since we have to move on.
Mm-hmm.
This has been amazing. Thank you so much.
Oh.
So just following on what you asked, I also get asked this question a lot, so I thought I'd put it to the panel. And it's to do with holding on to women. So the tremendous lack of mentors in the technology industry who are female. How do we hold on to women? How do we stop the leaky pipe? What do we need to do systematically to keep women in the game? How do we get women to, staying at the table? Thank you.
Carol and Josie, do you want to answer this? And then we'll bring this to a close.
Yeah, so terrific question. One thing I would clarify is also beyond mentorship, it's important to find sponsorship. So someone who's actually really trying to pull you through the pipeline as opposed to just meeting for coffee once in a while. I will say that while female role models have really, really inspired me to go down this path, and you can't be what you can't see, so I think your point is fantastic, that to see women, and it's almost like a marketing campaign, that's really important. A lot of my sponsors have actually been males who have been so supportive and so helpful in my career and have time to give advice. A lot of the female role models are so busy and overwhelmed because their job is also to take on and mentor all the females. So I would say that look also to male sponsorship as well, because they're extremely connected as well and have different ways of helping. So it's good to look for both. I would say talk to peers. Like, I think you need a large support system to get through anything in life. So I think along every step of the way, I've just tried to reach out to as many people and find a natural fit for who would be beneficial both ways, where I could help give different perspectives and then they would help with their perspectives on things.
Josie, do you want to give us a quick answer and then we have to wrap up because we're out of time?
Very quickly, I think it's also looking at structural things. So the economy in the workplace is still set up for a man who's got a wife at home, and if you are the wife, then what have you got? So I think it's also looking at how do we build organisations that make it easier for people from all different kinds of backgrounds and family situations to excel and to be leaders. I think that helps too.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much. What a wonderful discussion. Thank you all for joining us. Can we have a round of applause for our panel?